So it is 11 o'clock, so I'm hoping that you've got one of these, because if you do, it allows you to gently slumber on this nice February morning, because all really that I'm going to say is on there as well. I'm not expecting you to read it. I'm not expecting to test you on it, but you've got it. And I should also just say a little bit about how I'm going to tackle this subject, because Nicholas de Hereford, who is the subject of this morning, he exists in footnotes and he exists in side comments, but there's only one article that I've come across at all, which was done by the Fownhope Naturalist Society back in the 1920s, I think, actually on Nicholas de Hereford himself. So this is a jigsaw, and of course, whenever you're compiling bits of information together, you get conflicting bits of information. So what I've done is I've come up with what I think is what I think is right. But then I always think I'm right, you know that by now. But so I'll just say what I've got, but there are one or two areas which I will highlight where there's some dispute about it. So what I thought might be the best thing to do first is to simply go through the background of the 14th century, because you can't really understand the man apart from his time. So the 14th century was, it's held by many to be the worst of the centuries, because a number of things happened. First of all, you good parishioners here of various parishes, the likelihood is that you would have been subsistence farmers of some kind or another. Most of you would be illiterate, the vast majority of you would be illiterate, and you would be scratching out some sort of existence on the farms that you have, but you wouldn't be really making an awful lot off them. Some of you would have done rather better. You would have taken over a bit more land, you've managed to sell some things on, and you've managed to work your way up. But you would have been peasants of one kind or another. Some of you would have been tied to the land, that you had to work almost in servitude for your local lord. Others of you, not so much, you had more freedom, but unless you actually really owned a manor, I'll come back to that in a minute, then you would have been a peasant of some sort. And you also would have been impressed by the new buildings around you that you're seeing going up, because this was the great period of the wool trade. For England, we did very well off the wool trade. I'll come back to that in a minute. But this was the kind of setting that you're in. Now, going back to these courts, these manors, you would have been tied to a manor. There's a manor here at Fownhope, and they would have had within them the manorial courts, which is why we have Fownhope Court, Sufton Court, which we'll come back to obviously clearly, and other places, because this was where the lowest tier of any kind of legal control was exercised. And so you would have been very much under the local lord. It may have been somebody like the de Hereford family who've been at Sufton since the 12th century, or it might have been, if you're in Woolhope, then you would have been under the cathedral, because the manor there was given to the cathedral by Woolviver. And a lot of these manors were owned by the church. Now, we'll come back to the church later, because as usual, the church hierarchy is at the root of most of the issues. But just for now, to know that you've got this kind of sense of control often by the church as well. But locally, you would have been impressed by the buildings going on. Rivers were important, you see, in the 14th century, because that's how you got around. It's how we got around when the road collapsed between here and Hereford a few years ago. The river would have been the quickest way to get into town. It often still is. And so, because we were on a great highway, then we had that access to trade in Herefordshire. There's lots of these rivers around Herefordshire. Also, the rivers meant that you had access to plenty of water. Good for watering your flocks of sheep. Good also for washing their fleece. So Herefordshire was quite prosperous at this time. During the 14th century, this church was expanded that way and that way and that way. During the 14th century, maybe the 13th century, the spire was added. So we've got a great sense of boom, and you can see it in the buildings themselves. That's why, by the way, the first chancel arch here is Norman, but the second chancel arch is much later, because this whole building was extended out that way, so that it would be fancy, and so that the lords of Hereford, of Fownhope rather, would feel themselves fancier than those lords up at Sufton, because their church is bigger than their church, if you see what I mean. And the sheep were important. Ryland sheep, who are still around as a breed, the Ryland sheep were known as Leinster Ore, because they were such a source of money for this area. And the cathedral, a grammar school, was founded at this stage in Hereford, which became Hereford Cathedral School. Now, some would suggest that it goes back earlier, but the first head teacher we know of comes from this time. But against all that good stuff, you've got other things which aren't so good, like plague. This is the time of the Black Death. And the Black Death, if you contracted the plague, give it a couple of days and you'd be dead. It was known as the Great Dying at the time, and it landed on our shores in 1348. And it was more virulent amongst the poor than the rich, because people tended to be more huddled together. And we know that in Herefordshire, and was it in the diocese? Yes, in the diocese of Hereford, we know that over half the clergy died of plague at this time, higher than the death rate amongst the rest of the population, because the clergy during the plague didn't shut the church doors and say, go and watch it on YouTube. The clergy in the plague were out amongst the people, and they were conducting these funerals, and so they would contract it themselves in greater numbers. And estimates vary, but somewhere around a third, somewhere between a quarter and a half, so let's say a third, somewhere around a third of the population died. And in the city, we know that so many clergy died that the canons of the cathedral were busily going out taking services, because there was nobody else to do it. And it was not uncommon that you'd have more dead than alive in a particular village. It hit some villages harder than it did others. And another consequence, which is rather important for what will come up, is that as the clergy died, they needed more clergy. So they would look around the widowers, people whose wives had died in the plague, and in a rush they would ordain them. So there would be somebody to take the services. So the quality of the clergy, which was already questionable, took rather a dive south as a result of this as well. We'll come back to the quality of the clergy. But for you peasants sat there was an opportunity, because if a third of the workforce has gone, you can charge more for your labour. And so you did. The problem was, though, that this meant there was lower profits for the lords and for those who operated the trade, so they weren't pleased. So Parliament passed the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and then the Statute of Labourers in 1351 to reduce wages back to pre-plague levels and to fix them. But who pays attention to that? So people would still keep raising their wages. So they then brought in another statute, and from 1361, if you were caught raising your wages, then you would either face imprisonment or they might just brand you instead, so that everybody knew what it was that you'd been doing. That wasn't popular, by the way, you would have picked up, but it was a way of trying to reduce the spiralling costs of labour at that time, and it was quite draconian. But there was another shadow cast across this entire, pretty much this entire century, which was the 100 Years' War beginning in 1337 with France. Now, this wasn't one war that lasted 100 years, but rather it was a series of different wars and battles and skirmishes with truces in between, which spanned a slightly longer period, actually, ending in 1453. The English, you see, the English monarchy thought that they had a good claim to the French throne, whereas the French monarchy thought that they didn't. So there was battles around this. We were, of course, dynastically ruled by the French at this stage. The Normans were, as you know, French, coming across in that way. But wars need men to fight them. So you started to find that longbow practice would be compulsory. So on various greens around, people would be on a Sunday, on the Sabbath, practicing their longbow. For a period of time, football was outlawed because you should be practicing your longbow instead. And this has some unintended consequences, which you'll see in a minute, erupt. It means that most of your peasantry are now battle-trained and battle-hardened, because many had served overseas and come back. Also, most of them were armed in one way or another. They would have had their own longbow up in the corner of their hut. Some of them may still have had various bits of forged machinery. So you take a bill hook and then you might add some spikes on it so you can poke people at a distance. So you've started to arm your peasantry who are already fed up because you've capped their wages. You can see where this may be going. And also, with the longbow in particular, the longbow has flattened society to an extent. It used to be that the knights with their armour and on their horses it was as if they were coming in with tanks. They were unassailable. With the longbow, though, a peasant can easily kill at a distance a knight. That takes the gloss off the knights a bit. It makes them look less invincible. So you've got peasantry who are fed up, and you've got peasantry who are armed. That's quite a tricky situation. So what do you do as a government? Well, you, as a parliament, you make it worse. And the best way to make it worse is you say, well, not only have you fought overseas, but actually what you need to do is we need to raise more taxes from you because, this is an expensive business fighting overseas. So in 1377, every single person above the age of 14 had to pay a groat. I discovered a groat is 4p. Did you know that? I didn't know. You knew that. Well, I wasn't going to say you were there at the time, but you remember that. But a groat is about 4p, and 4p is about, 3p is what you'd get for a day's work. So it's quite a significant hit. And that's a flat poll tax, remember that, across the nation. 1379, they have another go. So there is another poll tax, but this time it's on a sliding scale so that the wealthier pay more. Your peasants are still paying a groat, 4p, but your rich people, the richest tier, John of Gaunt, the Archbishop of Canterbury, are paying about 400 groats at that time. The next year, 1380, they say we need some more taxation. Hooray for that. And they introduce another flat rate tax, at this time, though, at 3 groats. That's 12p, or 4 days' work on everyone. This isn't particularly popular. One other quick factor before we get to how this all blows up. There's an increasing anti-French sentiment, which is tricky for the Norman lords, and it's tricky for the many, many French monasteries who have outposts and abbeys in England. So we start to see the court replacing in 1362 French as its official language with English. By 1385, all those English schoolboys are translating their Latin into English and not into French. So Latin, of course, remains the language of the church, but we find that English is being much more widely used in the hierarchy because of this anti-French sentiment. There's ill feeling towards the French because A, they're refusing to let us have the crown, and that's just mean. B, they will not simply be defeated, and that's irritating. And C, this is costing rather a lot. All of this results in an ill feeling towards the nobility, an ill feeling towards those particularly who are French nobility, and plenty of those around, including at Sufton, and ill feeling by peasants who are armed, who know how to use a crossbow and have got their own weapons. So 1381, the peasants revolt. I'm just going to quote to you something from, it's a well-known passage, I know, but from John Bull. And now John Ball, B-A-L-L, not John Bull, John Ball was a preacher and was very much involved in this. And he says, when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman. From the beginning, all men by nature were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. For if God would have had any bondmen from the beginning, he would have appointed who should be bond and who should be free. And therefore I exhort you to consider that now is the time is come, appointed to us by God, in which ye may, if ye will, cast off the yoke of bondage and recover liberty. I've told you all of that because it gives you something of a background to Wycliffe, who we'll get to a little bit later because he's important. But it just gives you this sense of the vernacular language becoming very important. You'll see why that's important. It will give you a sense that there's a kind of sense of revolution out there in the nation. And although we may think of the Peasants' Revolt as being against just the lords and therefore what you might call the state, don't forget that the Chancellor at the time was the Archbishop of Canterbury, because he had spare time, and he was killed at the Peasants' Revolt. We've had two archbishops who have been killed at various times by revolting peasants or revolting parliament, but he was the first of them. And so, because many of these manors were owned by the church is implicated in all of this. And also, the church wants to establish the existing order because it's good for them in that way. Any questions on that before I move to the church itself? Good. The church then. Now, I don't want to give the impression that the church and the state are separate, because really you can't separate the church and the state at that time any more than you can separate religion and politics within the Bible. But the two are so clearly intertwined, and at this stage the church is very dominant and is very closely woven into the state, much more so than we have now. And the church dominated society. It was said that just before the dissolution of the monasteries in England, that on average you could walk to a monastery within half an hour. So they were all over the place. We know of at least 20 monastic institutions in Herefordshire, and we know that there were 11 different orders of monks and others who were operating around about. Greyfriars Bridge. Greyfriars Bridge is in Hereford because the Greyfriars, the Franciscans, were there. And so they were very visible. You would expect to see people walking around in clear monastic garb all the time. They're very much woven and very visible into wider society. They would also take a tenth of everything you own. And you, of course, would be grateful for that, because there's nothing more that any of you like to do than to give money to the church. It gives you a tremendous warm glow. And you can see evidence of this by the fact that the tithe bar, if you go to Mordiford, if you stand sort of on the other side of the lug looking across, you can see the church there looking like a church, great. You then see the rectory next to it, which I know is much later than all of this, but almost dwarfs the church in some ways. A nice big building for the rector there, he's doing well. And then you can see along that, what is now converted into a big house, is an enormous tithe barn, because the tithes are so great. Large tithe barn in what's now the sort of lay-by that we park in on the side of the church over there. And so these tithes would come in and they'll be recorded minutely in details what you'd paid that year. That's why, by the way, at the Peasants' Revolt, one of the things they wanted to do was to burn the records. That was their main aim, because this is their means of control. The church also controlled education at that time, because they'd want to educate their clergy to some extent, and also they would set up schools. The monastic institutions were great centres of learning. You would all have been expected to come to Mass at 9 a.m. on a Sunday, and it would have been good for you. I here would be your parish priest. Now, given the fact we're in rural Herefordshire and quite a long way from anywhere, and given the fact that we're not near Hereford particularly at that stage, well, I wouldn't necessarily know Latin. I would know enough that I could recite the Mass in a way that was pretty good, but I might garble it a bit. You will know, many of you, that the phrase hocus pocus comes from hic est corpus, this is the body, because that was the main time when you would know, oh, okay, this means that something important is going on. It's when I raise the host or the bread, as it was known at that time. So I would probably garble this. You wouldn't really have much of an understanding of what was going on because you didn't speak Latin. And in any case, you're illiterate, so there's no point giving you service books. You don't need to waste them. Across here, in front of this arch, there would have been a rood screen. And we can still see that you could have got into a staircase here. The door's still there, stoned up. And you would have come out at the top. And then I might, at time to time, celebrate Mass up there. But most of the time, I'm back behind the rood screen. And you'll know this is a long church because it was extended to show how important and lovely Fownhope is. And so when you're sat at the back, which is where people tend to sit in church, and I'm right at the front and there's a screen in between, well, you don't really know what's going on. And to be quite honest, I probably wouldn't know what was going on either. But nonetheless, I would do it. I would probably not bother to preach a sermon. I might preach a sermon, but I wouldn't really often be bothered to do that. So there are pluses at this stage. And because I may well not know my stuff, I might instead just tell you stories, because that's kind of what I would know. And then I'd go back behind the screen and who knows what would happen. Commonly, I wouldn't be a graduate, so commonly I wouldn't have been particularly well educated in that way. I would be expected to care for the poor. Tithes come in, I get my stipend, and I'd give money out to the poor. So you'd like me from that point of view. I'd collect your tithes in, so you'd hate me from that point of view. And then fairly often, I'm afraid, that the clergy thought, do you know what? I think I might just go somewhere else for, until I need to collect the tithes in again. And they'd go off to the cities and just live there, and nothing much would happen on the ground. They might have a curate, hooray, who would come and do the work for them. So there was a sense, particularly in the richer livings, as they were known, where there's a lot of tithes coming in, and often a lot of glebe land was owned for farms, you really wouldn't see your priest much at all because they'd be gallivanting. I would, though, be expected to make sure that you knew the creed. I'd be expected to make sure that you knew the Ten Commandments. You have an echo of that in the prayer book communion service, which recites the Ten Commandments at the beginning and, of course, has the creed. I would then be expected to teach you about the 7 sacraments, baptism and Eucharist or communion. Still, we hold that in the Church of England, but also confirmation, reconciliation, that's another word for confession, anointing of the sick, marriage, and holy orders. So you'd know all about those, and that these are means of grace, that these are ways that God confers his grace upon you. You would be expected to know the 7 works of mercy: bury the dead, visit the imprisoned, feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, clothe the naked, visit the sick, refresh the thirsty. You'd know the 7 virtues: chastity, temperance, charity, diligence, kindness, patience, and humility. And you'd know the 7 deadly sins, and you'd know to avoid them: lust, gluttony, avarice, sloth, envy, wrath, and pride. So this gives you quite a moralistic understanding of Christianity. Because basically I'm pretty poorly trained myself, I don't know much of what's going on. I probably haven't read much of the Bible anyway, and I'm expected to teach you to do these good deeds. You can see how Christianity becomes quite about things that you do. It becomes quite what would later be known as a works-based religion. Do enough good deeds like a Boy Scout, and that will give you your pass into heaven. Do enough deeds, and you hope it will weigh out the bad deeds that you've done. All of this, you see how it can develop if all you're being told are these moral acts. Church was rich as well. My goodness, the church was rich. Happy days. The monastic orders themselves were notorious for being fat and for not doing much. Oh, they'd employ lay brothers who would do all the work for them. So there was a lot of ill feeling towards the monks. And there was a widespread assumption that the Black Death was a punishment against the wickedness of England, but also quite a widespread assumption that it was God's punishment against the corruption of the church. But at least you're all one church. At least we haven't got denominations. At least you're one church under one pope and you know where you are. Well, this brings me on to something else that very much marks this period. In 1309, so Nicholas de Hereford is born about 1330, so we're a little bit earlier than this. 1330, 13 something. There'd been quite a history of conflict between the papacy and France. France was on the ascension at the moment. It was ascending, it was doing well. And they really didn't like the idea that the popes seemed to think that they could control them, because these are Italians. Who wants the Italians in charge? That's never ended well. So they didn't want to have this kind of foreign interference. So in 1305, the French king, Philip IV, forced a conclave, which is where you elect the popes, to elect a French pope. That'll sort it out, called Clement V. That wasn't popular, but Clement V nonetheless was the pope, and he thought maybe best not to live in Rome, and so he moved to Avignon, built himself a nice new palace there, all mod cons, very nice, happy. This all carried on. The popes lived in Avignon rather than Rome. Romans weren't happy with that, but nonetheless, that's where they lived. But in 1377, for whatever reason, Gregory XI moves back to Rome. So now the popes are back in Rome. Hooray for that. A year later, he dies and is succeeded by Urban VI. But Urban VI, well, he doesn't get on with the cardinals, particularly the French cardinals. So the French cardinals say, well, this Urban VI chap, his election wasn't valid. So we're going to appoint instead another pope, Clement VII. He'll be our pope. And Urban VI said, well, hang on, no, I don't quite agree with that. So Clement moves down to Avignon and is pope there, and Urban remains in Rome and is pope there. You've got two popes now. So that's quite embarrassing. But this carries on for quite some time. And we have these two popes, and as we've seen, this is quite political, because you've got a French pope and you've got an Italian pope. So the French pope, well, the English are going to have nothing to do with that pope, because that's a French pope. We've established we don't like the French, but we're going to deal instead with the Italian pope, because that'll really irritate the French, and therefore is a good thing to do. So it's a very politicised split papacy. But of course, the sensible thing happens eventually. In 1409, the Council of Pisa declares, they meet to try and sort this nonsense out. So it declares that both popes are invalid, and instead they elect a third pope, Alexander V, in their place. So we get rid of these two other popes and we've re-elected one pope, so everything is happy. Except the two deposed popes say, well, we're not having that. So now we have three popes. We've got a pope in Avignon, we've got a pope in Pisa, and we've got a pope in Rome. And we have that carrying on. For 5 years, we've got these three popes. And then another council, which takes 4 years to sort this out, in the end, forces the Roman and Pisan popes to resign, which they do. The Avignon popes having none of that, so they excommunicate him, because it's hard to be a pope if you're excommunicated. Martin V is elected, and they move to Rome, and what's known as the Western Schism ends. That's a lot of background, but I want to give you a sense of how the church is being received at the time. Are you sort of happy bunny? Well, you don't have to be happy about that, but you understand all that kind of stuff. Good. Right. This brings me now to John Wycliffe. Now, John Wycliffe is a significant figure. We may do something on John Wycliffe again on one of these Saturday mornings, but for now I just want to focus on what he taught rather than his life, which was an extraordinary life in many ways. Remember how I'd said that Christianity's become quite moralistic. Do the 7 acts of mercy, follow the 7 virtues, all this kind of stuff. And you have this understanding, therefore, that if you do enough stuff and you're in good favour with the church, then you'll get to heaven. You may need to spend some time in purgatory getting there, but you'll get to heaven eventually. Against that, Wycliffe teaches that actually it's our faith in Christ which is the important factor in all of this. Trust wholly in Christ, rely altogether on his sufferings. Beware of seeking to be justified in any other way than by his righteousness. Faith in our Lord Jesus Christ is sufficient for salvation. So he's very much seen as a forerunner of the Reformation. So his study of the Scriptures has brought him to this extent. And he's a significant figure. He's Master of Balliol. He's a significant figure in Oxford, and his views are taking hold there. He also teaches predestination, which you'll know is Article 20 of the, no, it's not, Article 17 of the 39 Articles. It's part of our understanding of the faith. And he therefore, because of that, also teaches, picking up on the church fathers, that you have a visible church, you lot on a Sunday morning, and you have an invisible church, those of you lot who are called and predestined by God, the true Christians. So he's starting to say that actually what makes you a Christian isn't so much your attendance at church or the good deeds that you've done or that you've donated a good lot of money to reshingle the spire. It's not that. It's your faith in Christ, which is a result of God drawing you to himself, his predestination. That's quite a challenge to the Roman Catholic Church, or the church at the time. There was no Roman Catholic Church, it was just the church. He also is iconoclastic, which is a way of saying he didn't like icons and the use of images within services. And of course, that again is a bit of a challenge. He questioned this whole practice of the veneration of the saints. Well, the saints do good business. The shrine of Thomas de Cantilupe in Hereford Cathedral was the second most visited shrine behind that of Thomas à Becket at Canterbury. So if you're going to stop people going to the shrine, then you're going to stop them donating lots of lovely money to the cathedral. That surely can't be good. You're going to stop them going to the little gift shop on the way out. That can't be good. And you know, the cathedral's doing good trade at the moment. So this is a challenge. The most crucial challenge, though, is against transubstantiation, the doctrine that the bread and the wine become the literal body and blood of Christ. They may look to you like bread and wine. Their outward form remains as bread and wine, but their inner substance is the flesh and the blood of Christ. He writes this: the consecrated host we priests make and bless is not the body of the Lord, but an effectual sign of it. It is not to be understood that the body of Christ comes down from heaven to the host consecrated in every church. This is dynamite. The reason why I can control you as your parish priest is that I have the power to bring Christ down upon the altar into the host and into the bread and the wine, and I can then distribute that to you. I can call God down here in this building, and that's an extraordinary thing to have. And I'm the only one who can do this because I'm a priest in the church. And so you laity, most of you, you've got no power to do this. You laity, this is above your pay grade. You may be the King of England, but you can't do this. I've got a higher thing than all of that. I can bring God down here. And so I've got real spiritual power. So to deny transubstantiation isn't simply a doctrinal thing. It kicks at the power and the authority of the church. Take away transubstantiation, you take away a lot of the power of the church and the popular imagination. Does that make sense? It's quite a crucial point. Good. He doesn't like monks. He thinks they're fat. He doesn't like friars. These are the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinian canons, and the rest of them, because they go around begging for alms, but then he thinks they spend it all on themselves. And so he doesn't like the friars much either. And actually, there's a big argument between the friars and others at the University of Oxford at this time as well. So this is a bit of the background to that. He questions the legitimacy of the papacy. Right, the Pope is the head of the church. Right, which Pope? Which one of these two popes are we saying is the head of the church now? Christ is the head of the church, not popes. So you can see how he's playing into a lot of this. He says that the church should be poor, that clergy should be poor. Poverty is the apostolic thing. And you can see against the background of the Peasants' Revolt, where the church are the manors and the lords in many places, you can see how that is a popular thing. He says the Bible should be in English. All truths necessary to faith are to be found expressly in the Bible, and the more necessary, the more expressly. And so therefore it should be in English. And we can see how the anti-French stuff has meant that now we've got an English-speaking court, and we're saying that English is the language of the nation, but the church is keeping it in Latin. You can't understand Latin. I probably can't understand Latin. So why is that a thing? And in fact, you should be able to read and meditate on the scriptures yourself, if you can read. Huge caveat there. But you should at least have it read to you so you can understand it being read. And those who followed him were known as Lollards. The first group of Lollards was led in 1382 from Oxford by Nicholas de Hereford. I did get there. So we are now at Nicholas. But Wycliffe, I'm not going to go into a lot of his life, but the basic teachings, you've got to head around that. And you can see how revolutionary they are at the time and why the church might think it's a bit much. Because you can get a sense of what's going on there. Good. Now to our man, Nicholas de Hereford. Now, he's born in 1330, so you can see that makes him pretty much a contemporary of Wycliffe. He's born in 1330 at Sufton, Old Sufton, I assume, at that stage. And he's the third son, too late. He's the third son of John de Hereford, who at that stage owns Sufton. So he marries, he has two sons, and fairly early his wife dies. And so he does what a lot of widowers do at that stage. He goes into the church. Now, remember that the Catholic understanding of celibacy, which only really dates back to a couple of centuries earlier than this in any case, but it doesn't mean you can't have been married. It just means that whilst you're a priest, you're not married and you're celibate. So if your wife has died and you're a widower, you're then free to become a priest. So you needn't think that it meant celibacy for life. It meant at the point of your ordination, celibacy for the rest of your life. So it wasn't unusual for this to happen. He's also clearly quite a bright chap because we know he was 40, by the way, when he was ordained. So he was already a fair age. And we know he's around Oxford at this stage as well. And in 1374, he becomes a fellow of his college, which is Queen's College, Oxford. So he's clearly an academic chap. This is not some young, bright person coming up. This is somebody of an older age, and he's coming into the whole education system, and he makes a name for himself later on. And in 1377, a mandate was issued by Edward III, the king, instructing that Nicholas de Hereford be made chancellor of the cathedral here. But it was never enacted. And at this stage, it was known, in Oxford at least, that Nicholas de Hereford was a follower of Wycliffe. I wonder whether that news had got back home as well, and whether the cathedral was slightly less than happy with having a Wycliffite saying, give away all your money, coming to Hereford, where there's a shrine to Thomas de Cantilupe doing good business. 1380. Around this stage, in the early 1380s, he's translating the Bible into English. This is a very Wycliffite thing to do. He is the first to translate the Old Testament from the Vulgate, from the Latin, into English. Now, later on, with Tyndale, he's going back to the Hebrew and Greek. But at this stage, they're only really focusing on the Latin Vulgate. They're not thinking to take that further step back at that stage. There's a copy of this Bible in the Bodleian still. It still exists. And it stops in the Apocrypha, Baruch 3:30. He got that far, for some reason stopped halfway through that chapter. Well, we'll see some reasons why, because he ended up being captured. There's another copy, early contemporary copy of that Bible again. I think I'm right in saying the second one's also in the Bodleian. And where it stops at Baruch 3:30, a little note is there. Here ends the translation of Nicholas de Hereford. Hooray! 1380 also is quite a pivotal time, the early 1380s. Peasants' revolt in 1381. Country on a bit of a knife edge. Peasants' revolt, I'm glad to tell you, began in Essex. And it may be that this is some of the reasons why he stopped. It may be because of what went on in 1382. that he stops there, because 1382 is a big year for Nicholas de Hereford. First of all, he receives his doctorate in divinity. Hooray for Nicholas de Hereford. So he's gone through the ranks. He's now a doctor of the faith. He's now respected as a theologian within the university. But he's also preaching vigorously against the Franciscans and the all the others that are there, the Dominicans and all these other orders. And that's not going down well. In fact, the Franciscans write to John of Gaunt to say, who's pretty much the de facto ruler of England at that time, because Henry II is just a wee lad. They're saying, this chap's an absolute nuisance, get rid of him. But John of Gaunt doesn't. He seems to be, Nicholas de Hereford, under some sort of patronage of John of Gaunt. Chaucer was also under the patronage of John of Gaunt at the same time. Maybe they met, maybe they didn't. But he keeps preaching. He then ups the ante. He says, no mendicant orders, no friars, no Franciscans or Dominicans should receive degrees from the university. They should be stripped of all their honours in the university and sent off somewhere else. So he's winning friends there. And then he preaches a sermon in Oxford in 1382 on Ascension Day, denouncing clerical luxury, affirming that every Christian should be able to read the Bible and meditate on it in their own language. And he's inciting people to the views of Wycliffe. And there is huge controversy over this. And as a result, the Archbishop of Canterbury feels he has to get involved. So he writes to the University of Oxford saying, Wycliffe and Hereford, he's named, and others should be suspended. But the authorities of Oxford think, well, this is the Archbishop of Canterbury. We're in Oxford. He seems to have missed that vital point. So instead, they do suspend somebody, but they suspend the anti-Lollard person, the person who was against Wycliffe and Hereford and the rest. So they're asserting their authority here. And then in June, the first full manuscript of the English Bible is produced. That's a big deal as well. Which brings me to the Earthquake Synod, or the Council of Blackfriars. This has gone too far. So the Archbishop calls a council in Blackfriars, during which there's an earthquake in the Dover Straits, which shakes London, so that's very portentous. And they discuss this problem, and the particular issue is transubstantiation. Remember, that is the superpower that the church has. And so to deny that is a big problem. So the main focus of this synod is transubstantiation, and Wycliffe and Nicholas de Hereford are named as people who are causing problems on this. So they are summoned to London. And they say, we're not going. So they stay in Oxford. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury on the 1st of July says, well, in which case we excommunicate you. Take that. And so on July the 18th, Richard II sent orders to the university to banish Wycliffe and Hereford. A week later, the Chancellor writes back and says, terribly sorry, old chap, we don't know where they are. They've gone. They clearly got wind of this, or maybe were tipped off by the Chancellor, and they fled. On the 6th of August, there is a mandate, still in the archives here, sent by the Archbishop via the Bishop of London to the Bishop of Hereford. And it's clear from that that Nicholas de Hereford is now hiding in a monastery in Leicester under the shadow of John of Gaunt's castle. Remember how John of Gaunt earlier in the year had backed Wycliffe and Hereford? So he's fled to Leicester, hoping that John of Gaunt will protect him. But he's not interested. This has gone too far, really. And so the companion of Nicholas de Hereford recants at that stage his Lollard beliefs, and a few years later becomes a cardinal. But not so Nicholas de Hereford. Man of Herefordshire as he is, solid and certain in his views, he says, right, I'm going to go to the Pope then. So I'm going to convince the Pope that transubstantiation is a bad thing. So off he sets, and off he goes towards the Pope. He flees, he escapes from there, and he goes to Pope Urban VI in Rome to convince him that he needs to change the teachings of the church. But when he's there, he ends up with all these cardinals who's sort of getting in the way. You can never quite get to the person you want to. It's like when you phone up your electricity supplier and you have to press 1 to go here. So he gets caught up in this great web of cardinals and then ends up imprisoned in Rome, probably in the castle of San Angelo. And there he stays for about 3 years. But at least Urban VI, for some reason, has decided in 1385 to go to Naples. I don't know whether he decided he was going to move the whole thing there, probably just to go, take the air. And whilst he's away from Rome, there's a popular uprising against the papacy, and all the prisons are stormed and all the prisoners are released. And it seems as if that's when Nicholas de Hereford managed to get away and escape. There's another theory as well, but this one, it seems to me, makes the most sense. And so he comes back to England, never afraid of a fight. He comes back to England and he arrives on January the 15th, 1386. The Archbishop gets to hear of this because, of course, he's landing on the south coast, and he issues a demand that Nicholas de Hereford be arrested as a dangerous heretic. Why? Because he's back to preaching Lollardy, all this stuff of Wycliffe. And he's decided that the best place to do this is to preach this in Canterbury. So he's really rubbing the Archbishop's nose in it. But the Archbishop is harrying him. He's pursuing him around. And he ends up imprisoned in Nottingham Castle. But he escapes. So he's back on the run again and he moves west. He's coming back to the country that he knows better. The Bishop of Worcester then gets wind that Hereford and some others, and these are named in these documents, so we do know Nicholas de Hereford is around at the time, is travelling around in his diocese and is preaching Lollardy. So he's fed up with all of this and he issues a ban from the Diocese of Worcester for Nicholas de Hereford. The Diocese of Worcester is big at this stage, so Bristol is in the Diocese of Worcester, Gloucester is in the Diocese of Worcester. There's very few dioceses in England at that stage, and they're vast. You can't throw a rock now for hitting a bishop. There's loads of them now, but then the Church in England was running on far fewer. But nonetheless, he carries on preaching. He preaches freely in public. He preaches in private halls. He'll preach in people's chambers. He'll preach in churchyards. Some priests are even inviting him to come in and preach in their churches. So this is becoming a real issue. So he carries on. He disappears off the radar for a bit because he's kind of on the run, really. I mean, how romantic, a kind of a preacher on the run. And he's there preaching around in these sorts of areas. And Lollardy is strong in Herefordshire and Gloucestershire and those areas. This is very much the hotbed for all of this kind of way of thinking. And then something unexpected happens. In 1390, his nephew dies. His nephew died aged only 25. And at this stage, his nephew hadn't any children. So now, Nicholas de Hereford inherits Sufton. And it's not passed to him. And this is an assumption, but remember, he's been excommunicated. He's been outlawed. He's on the run. So now there's rather a large carrot dangling over here of the Sufton estate, which he can't inherit. So we know it's being held in some sort of trust at the time. So just leave that carrot dangling. 1391, he's imprisoned for a third time in Saltwood Castle in Kent by the Archbishop of Canterbury. He then seems to have been tortured. The documents talk about being grievously tormented. I think at that stage that's meaning torture, not a kind of inner turmoil. But he seems to have been tortured, and he recants. He recants the Lollard beliefs. Now, I'm going to come back to that right at the end as to why he may have done that. But he recants and he's released under royal protection. In fact, he's appointed an inquisitor, part of the Inquisition. And he vigorously debates and disputes against his previous colleagues in the Lollards. And then in 1392, it's a document in the cathedral which reads that John Wheel, curate of, how about this for a spelling? Pyklyslie. Pixley. So he's curate of Pixley. John West, curate of Pixley. John Burgle, vicar of Lugwardine, confusingly. John Bailey and Maurice Netherwood, chaplains, had granted and released to Nicholas Hereford the manor of Mordiford called Sufton, with its appurtenances, except the lands and tenements which the said Nicholas de Hereford had already enjoyed by the gift of John Hereford, his father, jointly with this brother John, etc. So he inherits at that stage, which is why I wonder whether it was being held because he was excommunicate at that stage. The king, that same year, issues a pass because, unsurprisingly, Nicholas is being harried and troubled by Lollards. So he issues a safe conduct to, quote, our beloved subject, Nicholas Hereford, professor of sacred theology, who sets himself in his sermons against those doctrines of Antichrist. So his reconciliation to Mother Church and to the state is absolutely complete. Things then, obviously, the story starts to calm down here. We know, though, in 1393, he was one of the masters of theology at a trial of a chap called Walter Burt, who was a Lollard. And at the trial, another one of the Lollards complains that Nicholas de Hereford is there. He's not impressed with Nicholas de Hereford. He says this is good. Since no man putting his hand to the plough and looking back is fit for the kingdom of heaven, as is said by Christ, what wonder that Master Nicholas Hereford, who at first by the visitation perchance of the Holy Spirit put his hand, that is his former diligence, to the plough, that is the sowing of the word of God and of Holy Writ, both by preaching and by showing forth a pattern of good works, should by this time be wholly useless for the explaining of the knowledge of Holy Writ, which is understood by the kingdom of God. Certainly it is not wonderful, O Nicolaitan master, who like Nicholas, that most false deacon, has deserted the unerring knowledge of Holy Writ, etc., etc. Revelation, one of the letters to the churches, condemns the Nicolaitans. So they've clearly found that Nicholas must be a Nicolaitan. So there is this anger, you should understandable anger that is there. But he carries on in his quiet way up at Sufton. 1394, June 21st, he's made a canon of the cathedral. He may even be made a chancellor. It's not quite clear of the cathedral at that stage. But in 1397, January the 30th, he's made treasurer of Hereford Cathedral. And he's still, though, being bothered by the Lollards, because in 1401, on November the 22nd, he gets royal protection against the vengeance of the Lollards. That's in the records. And rather more pleasingly, 2 days later, he's granted for life a pipe of wine, yearly from the King's Prize at Bristol. So he gets a pipe of wine every year for the rest of his life from the King's own wines. A pipe, by the way, is 126 gallons of wine a year, or 1,008 pints of wine. So plenty just to take the edge off that bothering by the Lollards that he's been experiencing. One or two echoes of him left in the records. 1407, at a trial of Thorpe the Lollard, a clerk at that trial said that he had, quote, heard Nicholas Hereford say that since he forsook and revoked all the learning and opinion of the Lollards, he hath had mickle greater favour and more delight to hold against them than ever he had to hold with them. Anyway, 1417, he's an old man by this stage. He resigns his preferment and he's professed as a Carthusian monk. He goes to St. Anne's Monastery in Coventry, and in 1420, give or take, he dies. Now, that's the career of Nicholas de Hereford. I've got one or two things to say by way of conclusion, but any questions on that? The much escaping Nicholas de Hereford. Nicholas de Hereford isn't much remembered. And whilst you get other figures who are well remembered from that time, one of them is not, as I've said, Nicholas. The reason for that, I think, is that we now live in a Protestant country, and so our heroes tend to be Protestant. So Wycliffe would be a hero, and he obviously he didn't recant, and his doctrines ended up taken up by the Church of England. So we don't believe in transubstantiation in the Church of England. We have clergy who, to some extent, are educated, that we speak in the vernacular. And because of the way that the stipend doesn't keep pace with inflation, we are kept in poverty as well, and you all weep for us. But we have accepted very much Lollard views. So Nicholas de Hereford, by recanting those views, is seen as a traitor to them. And so in a sense, he's on the wrong side of this debate as all goes through. And I suspect that's one reason why he's not much remembered, because he is still the first person to have translated the Old Testament into English. That's an extraordinary thing to have next to your name. His translation was rather stiff. He kept it very literal. He kept the Latin word order, which is rather confusing if you're trying to speak English. He also had quite a strong Midlands accent. So, that may have been a thing. But then so did Shakespeare, and so did the Tyndale translation later, which becomes the foundation of the authorised version. And actually, in many ways, we all speak the Midlands version of English, because the written record, what is more influential in our nation than the Bible and then Shakespeare in terms of language, fix that Midlands version. So we needn't think that his accent was so strong that it couldn't be understood, although I do like to think it was written with a good, strong Herefordian accent. So we can't take that away from him. We can't take away the fact that he was clearly a brave man with a lot of front, who was willing to go to the Pope and say, I think you need to change your mind on the main thing that keeps the church in control over the rest of the world. He clearly had a lot of front, a lot of courage to do that. It's possible to take his recanting as being a sign of either weakness, or being a sign that he couldn't stand up to torture, or being a sign that actually he wanted the money that was there at Sufton. But remember, he's quite an old man at this stage. I mean, I hesitate to say that a man in his 60s is old, because that could have certain implications for others here. But in that day and age, that is a fair old age. And he has tried everything to convince the church of his views. There is no conception, notwithstanding the fact we've got two popes, there's no conception that you can have denominations at that time. There can only be one church. So if he's tried hard to change the mind of that church and failed, he's old, tired. Maybe he just says, well, I've lost the argument. And so he reconciles back to the church. That would be my charitable take on what went on there. But you can't take away from him the fact that the very things that he was pushing for and preaching for, abolition of monasticism, the Bible in the vernacular, a denial of transubstantiation, all those things are hallmarks of the Church of England. So in a sense, it took a few years, but in a sense, in the end, he did win. That's all I want to say, I think. Yes, look at that, exactly on 12. So if you have questions, do ask questions. Otherwise, if you want to hang around a bit longer, there will be some tea and some coffee, and maybe the promise of biscuits afterwards. But any questions or comments on all of that? Going once. In which case, class dismissed. Thank you very much. Thank you.